The Resident Evil series has no shortage of outbreaks across its mainline game entries and the countless spin-offs, animated movies, manga, and stage plays. But if you ask most people about what outbreak comes first to mind, they will almost always answer the Raccoon City Outbreak. The subject of multiple entries in the franchise and referenced by countless more, the events of this tragedy changed the course of the setting's world and the lives of all those who survived it. But just how deadly was this outbreak? How long did it last and how did it end? Today, I'm going to look back on this tragedy and all the facts to determine how many people lost their lives in the Raccoon City Outbreak. Before we can start to calculate how many people died in the outbreak, we need to define what does and does not count as part of the outbreak. Raccoon City and its surrounding region had suffered scattered incidents where zombies had attacked and killed citizens of the city throughout 1988, including the T-Virus outbreak at the Spencer Mansion, Ecliptic Express, and Umbrella Executive Training School. Despite the impact of these outbreaks, they occurred 2 months before the Raccoon City incident and were limited to the Arklay Mountain region. Likewise, the outbreak had consequences that lasted long after disrupting the city, such as the actions of Curtis Miller in 2005 as seen in Resident Evil Degeneration. Despite being a clear and direct result of the outbreak, all of these deaths took place after it. So for this video, I'll be defining the outbreak as strictly events starting from the botched kidnapping of William Birkin and the release of the T-Virus to the city's water supply and rat population, and ending with the city's destruction. Anyone who died before or after are outside the scope of this video. Raccoon City was a city in Arklay County in an unspecified part of the American Midwest. The city was founded in the 1960s and grew rapidly alongside the Umbrella Corporation. Umbrella would be heavily involved with the development of Raccoon City over the decades, most especially in the early 90s, where they heavily funded the city to pull it out of recession and in exchange gained considerable influence over the city behind the scenes. This allowed the company to operate with little interference from the local police and government and run their experiments for years without discovery. By 1998, the city had over 100,000 people living in it, as well as attracting tourists and hikers visiting the region. It had its own subway system, dock, stadium, and its own counterterrorism team, the Special Tactics and Rescue Service, commonly known as STARS. The Arklay County also had several small towns including Smallville, Rhodes Hill, Old Court, and Cedar. Details on these towns are sparse, mostly coming from Resident Evil Outbreak as stops on the subway system. Some may be suburbs of the city proper, but there are no canon sources to provide a definite answer. The standard size of a county in the Midwest is approximately 800 square miles, or 2,072 square kilometers, so there's no way to know how close they were to the city. For this video, I'll assume they were far enough away from the city to avoid the outbreak and destruction, as the average city size is about 355 square miles, or 919 square kilometers, leaving plenty of room for these towns to be located away from the city. The Raccoon City outbreak started shortly after midnight on Wednesday, September 23, 1988. Umbrella had become aware that researcher William Birkin was planning to defect to a rival corporation with his new G-Virus. Umbrella sent an Umbrella Security Services team led by experienced operative Hunk to secure the G-Virus and bring Birkin in alive. However, during their confrontation with Birkin, operator J. Martinez shot the scientist several times, fatally wounding him. The USS team took the T and G-Virus samples Birkin had prepared and left them to die. Out of anger and desperation, Birkin infected himself with the sample of the G-Virus, quickly mutating and giving chase after his would-be killers. In the following confrontation, Birkin would kill 3 members of the first team: J. Martinez, A. Kirkpatrick, and an unnamed member, as well as 3 members of the secondary team: Miguel, Derek, and Luke. Hunk would be the sole survivor of the first team, escaping into the sewers and eventually securing a sample of the G-Virus, while Goblin 6 would be the sole survivor of the second team. However, either from Birkin's attack or subsequent encounters during the outbreak, she would become injured and unable to move her legs, and as a result was trapped in the sewers, unable to do anything but desperately beg anyone who could hear her radio transmissions to come and save her. After Birkin's attack, the case containing the virus samples had been broken open, exposing a large number of rats and cockroaches to the T-Virus. The rats would be forced out of the sewers by the cockroaches, which grew larger in response to their infection, and would spread to Victory Lake, the main reservoir for the city. This spread the T-virus to the city's water supply, infecting tens of thousands of people over the course of the next day. Umbrella became aware of the outbreak and started putting plans into motion, followed shortly afterwards by the Pentagon discovering the outbreak and placing the region under martial law. The Pentagon implemented a quarantine on the city and began to evacuate civilians, setting up quarantine facilities to filter out anyone infected by the virus. The infected citizens of Raccoon City began to turn and attack other civilians, spreading confusion across the city on September 24th. By 7 p.m., the news was reporting on outbreaks of violence at a home game with Raccoon Sharks, and the RPD were attempting to set up roadblocks to contain the infection. By 9 p.m., with the help of survivors from Jay's Bar, the RPD destroyed Main Street to slow down the infected, with the fire department actively fighting the numerous fires that were breaking out across the city. After a rescue helicopter crashed due to rescued survivors turning to zombies, the military imposed a no-fly zone over Raccoon City and restricted civilian access into the city. The Army and National Guard would enforce a quarantine around the city, detaining any civilians who escaped the city and isolating them to prevent the spread of the T-virus. Around this time, RPD Chief Brian Irons began work to sabotage the RPD, ensuring they couldn't muster an effective defense before sending out a large number of them for a suicidal front-on assault on the zombie horde on Saturday, September 26th. Around the same time, Umbrella deployed the UBCS along with 4 platoons of hired mercenaries to also confront the zombies in a head-on fight. A platoon consists of between 20 to 50 soldiers, depending on country and organization type, but from my research, the UBCS presence in Raccoon City is estimated 120 operators split amongst 4 platoons: Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta. There was also a 5th team, Echo, which was meant to secure an evacuation point downtown. Unfortunately for these mercenaries, they were ill-prepared to fight against tens of thousands of zombies, along with the various BOWs that Umbrella had deployed to the city to test their performance against military personnel. At some point between the 26th and 27th, the Raccoon City Hospital was overrun, having already struggled with the surge of patients as they tried and ultimately succeeded in making a vaccine for the T-virus, albeit too late to save themselves. The situation in Raccoon City continued to deteriorate. By Monday, September 28th, the officers left in the RPD numbered barely over a dozen and realized they couldn't hold the building and began to organize an escape, though only a handful managed to flee, as detailed in the Desperate Time scenario in Outbreak File 2. It is at this time that Jill starts to make her escape, as depicted in Resident Evil 3, encountering the Nemesis on his mission to kill All-Star's members it finds in revenge for the death of the original Tyrant. Of course, at this time, there are only 2 members left in Raccoon City, and he manages to kill the only surviving STARS member who didn't fight the Tyrant, so not the best result. Still, he gave it his best shot. Things continue to spiral out of control in Raccoon City. The USBC is reduced down to its final 2 members, as the military outside suffers heavy casualties from the infected. The Pentagon deems its efforts to combat the outbreak a failure and begins a chaotic retreat on Tuesday, September 29th. The government had managed to keep the outbreak a secret from the general public, with stories about riots and radioactive spills to explain why the city was being blockaded. With the army in retreat and struggling to keep control of the situation, at least 3 people were able to enter the city: Leon S. Kennedy, Claire Redfield, and an unnamed truck driver, kicking off the events of Resident Evil 2. Over the course of the game, the RPD is finally overrun, seeing the end of the last major holdout against the outbreak, although small groups of survivors continue to make their way through the city. Hunk was also able to contact his extraction helicopter and escape, while Leon, Claire, and Sherry Birkin escaped the following morning on September 30th. During the outbreak, a congressional committee, which included Ron Davis and was advised by Derek Simmons, had been discussing options on how to resolve the crisis. On October 1st, a decision was reached to bomb Raccoon City. The official reason was to ensure that the virus was completely destroyed and that all of Umbrella's research along with it, so that no rival nation could seize it to jumpstart their own bioweapons programs. However, in truth, the government also wished to destroy all evidence of their own involvement with Umbrella's research, shifting all the blame entirely onto Umbrella. The no-fly zone over the city was rescinded, and the military began broadcasting into the city, advising all surviving personnel and civilians to escape the city while they still could. The final day of Raccoon City saw a lot of events happening as Umbrella scrambled to secure what last objectives they could, and the final survivors made their last desperate escapes from the city. The 8 survivors from Jay's bar wound up involved in 2 last-minute operations, with half of them being led by George to Raccoon University to recover the daylight vaccine, and were caught up in the UBCS's operation to eliminate Greg Mueller and take its Thanatos tyrant, while the other half, led by David, enter an Umbrella facility, deal with 2 factions of Umbrella fighting over the Nix BOW, with both groups escaping by daybreak. Jill Valentine and Carlos Oliveira made a last-ditch escape, killing Nemesis and escaping shortly before the city's destruction via helicopter piloted by Jill's fellow Stars agent, Barry Burton, and they left just before the bomb hit. At daybreak, the missile struck the heart of Raccoon City, wiping out the city completely and destroying everything within it, human and infected alike. A number of fans believe that it was a nuclear missile that hit Raccoon City. However, this is never stated in the games themselves. Resident Evil 3 writer Yasuhisa Kawamura stated in interviews that it was an experimental thermobaric missile instead, wiping out the city without irradiating the surrounding area. The number of missiles that hit Raccoon City is also up in the air. Both the original and remake version of Resident Evil 3 showed one single missile striking the city, while both Outbreak games showed multiple missiles hitting the city to level it. Outbreak also gave us a view of the wreckage of the city 6 months later, showing just how thoroughly the military's operation was in wiping every trace of the incident out of existence. Before I start to calculate how many people died in Raccoon City, it would be worth looking at who survived and how. The first group to look at would be Raccoon City residents who were outside the city when the outbreak happened. Chris Redfield, Barry Burton, and Rebecca Chambers immediately come to mind, with Curtis Miller having this as a key part of his backstory in the Degeneration movie. Between work, visiting relatives, or going on a well-timed holiday, a number of people would have been outside the city when the outbreak hit. Even if they tried to return, they would have been kept back by the military blockade. The next group to look at would be the people who left on the first few days. Despite the severity of the initial outbreak, we know that the military was quarantining people who left the city. Mayor Michael Warren was one such survivor, having fled immediately upon learning of the outbreak and leaving everyone, including his own daughter, behind. Warren surrendered himself into the custody of the US Army, although nothing more is known about his ultimate fate. We don't know how many people escaped the city unaffected and were detained by the military between the 24th, when the outbreak started, and the 29th, when it was pulled back due to the mounting casualties. It was likely that earlier someone made it to the blockade, the greater their chance of survival was. The final group would be those who escaped the city and were not caught, either by helicopter, train, or military vehicle. This list would include all playable characters of the Resident Evil 2, 3, and Outbreak. While only Alyssa Ashcroft is confirmed to have survived from the Outbreak cast, due to her writing a newspaper article in 2016 that Ethan Winters discovers in the Baker house, we know that the daylight vaccine is used to treat the T-virus after the outbreak as revealed in the Mahawa Desire manga series. Plus, I have a soft spot for those games, and don't want to accept a canon where they didn't survive. Most of these survivors escaped almost at the last minute via helicopter after the no-fly zone was lifted, while Leon, Claire, and Sherry escaped through a secret Umbrella train that the military likely didn't know about, running up far outside the city limits. Fortunately, this exit was closed before the train departed and destroyed when the train self-destructed, preventing any infected or BOWs from using it to escape the blockade. Nikolai's survival was situational in the original Resident Evil 3 and ambiguous in the remake, but documents found on Sheena Island suggest that he survived the outbreak and submitted a report by October 6th. Hunk reached his evac chopper and escaped before the no-fly zone was lifted, as Umbrella had an exemption from the order due to their influence over the government. The only official death count provided in the games comes at the end of Resident Evil 3 in the form of a radio broadcast, estimating the death toll was over 100,000.
And now we have a rather unfortunate turn of events. It seems that the President and the Federal Council have passed judgment over the civilians of Raccoon City. The President and Federal Council have ruled that the Bacillus Terminate operation is the best course of action for this extreme situation, and have since executed. Based on that fact, Raccoon City has been literally wiped off the map. Current reports have the death toll surpassing the 100,000 mark. Our hearts go out to those poor civilians of Raccoon City.
For the longest time, I operated on the assumption that the casualty count was at 100,000 and used that number in previous discussions on the topic of how many people had died due to the outbreaks in the franchise. But a tweet from Sisslethecat highlighted that there was a sports game at the start of the outbreak.
There was a disruption earlier at today's football match between the Raccoon Sharks and the Old Court Thunders. Apparently the game was interrupted when an unruly fan got out of control and sparked a riot. The number of injured is not yet known.
The English audio from the news broadcast states that the Raccoon Sharks were facing against the Old Court Thunders, likely from the Old Court town or district mentioned on the subway lines. However, the Thunders aren't named in the original Japanese audio during the scene, and it only exists as a localized edition. The Raccoon Sharks are an American football team, and from what parts of the stadium we see in official maps, they were competing in a standard sports stadium. From my research, these sports stadiums at a bare minimum hold 65,000 people. There's no evidence of it if this was a sold-out game and how many attendees were local fans versus out-of-towners. For simplicity's sake, I'll estimate that it was a full house and 50% of the fans were from outside Raccoon City, so that would add another 32,500 people to our casualty count, bringing us up to a total of 132,500 people. We know that there were people like Curtis Miller who lived in Raccoon City but were outside of it when the outbreak happened. Being a major tourist hub, we can also assume that there was a number of visitors in there as well. I'll treat and say that these two numbers would roughly cancel each other out, keeping our total at 132,500 people. We know that an unspecified number of people managed to escape besides playable characters, as we do see them at the end of the road scenario, as well as anyone who escaped prior to the blockade falling into chaos. This is mentioned in 2017 with a newspaper article talking about the hardship faced by Raccoon City survivors and their families. Despite the scale of the outbreak, there were still 100,000 people in the city. Anyone who wasn't infected by the water and was lucky enough to live close to the outside of the city would have had a good chance of getting out, and it was still possible for survivors to move throughout the city, at least up until the point where the RPD and USBC launched their ill-fated assault on the zombie horde. We also had several attempts by the military to save people, while they were boarded early on. I'd estimate this number would be in the low thousands, so I'll take 3,000 off the count and put the current total at 129,500,000. Of course, I have to bump it up by 118 for the USBC, taking us to 129,618. While I'm at it, I should add the initial USS squad that started this whole outbreak, so that becomes 129,625 casualties so far. I don't have full details on Echo Team, but as they're only referred to as a team and not a platoon, I'll consider them a standard squad of 12 soldiers to bring the total up to 129,637. Finally, we have the National Guard, the US Army, and the casualties they suffered that led to the city being written off as a lost cause. It's hard to define what would count as heavy casualties in such circumstances. I'll suggest they lost 2 squads worth of personnel, or 20 people in one day. There was at least one failed rescue attempt resulting in a helicopter crash, with a crew size of 4. A Delta Force squadron was sent in to assemble the Sword of Paracelsus railgun and were wiped out by tyrants, so we can assume another 12 casualties. It's hard to calculate how many more operations the military conducted in the series. Resident Evil, Operation Raccoon City, depicted a few, but that game's story is non-canon. These operations would likely be smaller in focus and have only 1 or 2 squads each, so I'll estimate another 20 soldiers dying from US Army operations. Umbrella's also conducting their own operations, but these were largely dropping off bioweapons, so I'll only add another 10 to cover them. Most of the victims who worked for Umbrella were also residents of the city, so they already fit under the initial 100,000 figure. Assuming no other casualties, this would bring the total estimated death toll up to 129,703. There was a lot of guesswork and assumptions made over details Capcom never specified. With all the canon facts that we do have, I feel that at most the outbreak would have claimed 130,000 lives. You could knock 10 to 15,000 people off of that total by assuming the Raccoon Sharks game wasn't sold out. Settling on this number, the outbreak was easily the deadliest in the franchise for many years. The outbreaks of the original game and Zero were limited to single locations, with 200 between the two games at most. It remained firmly in the lead up until Resident Evil 6, where the outbreak in Langshang potentially eclipsed it, but we can talk about that if I ever make a follow-up video. Every other documented outbreak in the franchise, outside of 6, were in small population centers, maxing out in the low thousands at most. The Raccoon City Outbreak was the first major outbreak in the franchise, and it stood as its most deadly for many years. While the fallout would ultimately destroy Umbrella, it also brought about the era of bioterrorism as numerous corporations and groups would start to use Umbrella's research to start their own outbreaks across the world. It forged several characters into taking an active part of the fight against BOWs, and while the franchise has moved away from Raccoon City, except when it comes time for remakes, it has left its mark and will never be forgotten.